Hello everyone, and welcome to the Responsible Use of Data seminar series organized as part of the Academic Fringe Festival. I'm Juana Inel, and today I have the pleasure to welcome and introduce Elena Simperl as our speaker. A little bit of background. In this seminar series on the topic of responsible use of data, we take a multidisciplinary view and explore lessons learned from success stories and examples in which the irresponsible use of data can create and foster inequality and inequity, perpetuate bias and prejudice, or produce unlawful or unethical outcomes. All these aspects urge us to discuss and draw certain guidelines to make the use of data a responsible practice. So today, Elena will talk about citizen science, the data view. Elena is a professor of computer science at King's College London, a fellow of the British Computer Society, and a former Turing Fellow. According to A Minor, she is in the top 100 most influential scholars in knowledge engineering of the last decade, as well as in the Women in AI 2000 ranking. Before joining King's College early 2020, she held positions at University of Southampton, as well as in Germany and Austria. Currently, she is the PI of 2 grants. One grant, Horizon 2020 Action, she's focusing on developing human AI methods to make participatory science thrive. And the second project, the EPSRC Data Stories, where she works on frameworks and tools to make data more engaging for everyone. Elena is well known and active in several communities, such as knowledge engineering, semantic technologies, open and linked data, social computing, crowdsourcing, and data-driven innovation. Before I give the floor to Elena, I would like to mention that this talk is recorded and is going to be made publicly available on YouTube in a couple of days. You can post your questions in the chat, and at the end of Elena's talk, I can either ask the question or you can raise your hand and unmute and ask the question yourself. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Elena again, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. This afternoon. I think responsible use of data is a hugely influential topic that we as scientists need to become more aware of. At the same time, we need also as computer scientists, as human-computer interaction designers, to think about new approaches and methods and techniques to help others use data responsibly. So today I'm going to talk about a particular context that is increasingly data-driven, and that is citizen science. And this context comes with some very specific challenges in terms of the collection of the data and its use by a range of stakeholders in a responsible way. Perhaps before I start, also just to mention that this is a talk that I haven't given many times, and there's lots of ongoing studies here and unpublished research, and that's perfectly fine for a public talk. I don't mind sharing any of these insights or preliminary insights with the community. Say, if anyone is interested in any of these topics, this is really very much ongoing work, and I'm looking forward to the feedback. So back to citizen science. That refers to a whole range of approaches related broadly to scientific research, but also to science education and engagement that enlist the public. Historically, it actually has been the only way to do science. If we think about great well-known scientists from previous centuries, they weren't what we call professional scientists. They were very much people who were interested in a particular topic, and then were finding supporters and funders and like-minded peers to go about their own scientific experiments and data collection efforts. However, citizen science as we know it today has changed a lot and has reached a whole new level of outreach and impact worldwide. Mostly because of the rise of digital tools, mobile devices, sensor networks, and internet connectivity. So the type of citizen science that I mean today is facilitated by these technologies. Science very much is fueled by people. We, or some of us here today, are scientists in many disciplines. We go out and ask people what they think, how they feel, how they behave. Also in natural sciences and engineering, we are doing experiments that require constantly more or better data from all sorts of devices and experimental settings, which require sometimes the help of volunteers. The perhaps most well-known example here is the Zooniverse citizen science platform. This is an online platform that hosts by now 100 or so citizen science programs, where volunteers without any requirement for scientific training in a particular subject go and help label data that is typically used to train machine learning algorithms. So a project there, I think the first project on Zooniverse was called Galaxy Zoo. So they had millions of images of galaxies collected through scientific instruments, and they needed training data sets for machine learning to be able to learn the shape and other properties of galaxies from images. At the same time, scientists and educators use participatory approaches that involve the public to bring science to new audiences. And this is particularly topical in 2020, 2021, when over the past 18 months, we have heard a lot of science, and both the media and the public have witnessed to some degree how scientific debate and scientific process actually works with mixed results. Citizen science, I hope from the examples that I have already given that you got a sense that there isn't just one way to do it, and it comes in many shapes and sizes. So sometimes it is facilitated by digital tools like mobile devices or a web browser. Equally, there are many citizen science projects where volunteers go out in the fields and count insects and follow specific data collection protocols and then report on the number and type of insects that they have seen. Or they take measurements in their backyard or in water bodies in the areas where they live, and then carry out specific sampling and analysis techniques and report on the data to professional scientists. Contributions equally vary from the labels of galaxies in galaxy zoos to measurements to really just participatory sensors where the volunteer is purchasing perhaps a light pollution sensor, and that sensor will make measurements and submit them automatically without much volunteer involvement to the science team. That refers to different forms of participation as well, from something very passive, where the sensor basically that is attached to someone's roof is reporting data to a scientific repository, to a much more active involvement where someone takes a picture, say, of a street light and sends it to an astronomer who then analyzes the degree of light pollution. There are citizen science projects in virtually any academic subject. Say the examples that I have given are from natural sciences, but there's a whole range of projects in digital humanities, for instance. An example is the Old Weather Project, where logs of ships from, I think, the 19th century, recording weather observations need to be transcribed by hand, by volunteers, to train machine learning algorithms that would be able to recognize the data at scale. And there are finally various stakeholders, there are scientists involved in citizen science projects, but not only. So increasingly, projects like this are also run by NGOs or public authorities. So now let's look at the data view. Well, there's many aspects of citizen science that are related to data. There's a question of methodology. So the way data is collected or analyzed in citizen science varies a lot from how we are trained to work with data in science. There's questions and concerns about quality, because of the nature of the data, how it is collected, and at the degree to which the volunteers are aware of collection protocols and perhaps context and subject-specific matters. There is a question of context in which someone performs a measurement or labels a particular data set, and that context is arguably important down the line, is also able to understand its limitations and assumptions. There are, as I will explain later on, consequences for people's privacy. Say when I put the sensor on my roof and it collects data and submits it somewhere, possibly geotagged, so that one builds a map of light pollution in the city, then I also to some degree disclose where I live. There's ethical questions about rewards and acknowledgements, and there's questions about preservation of the data. Say a lot of time and effort, including the time and effort of the general public, goes into collecting, labeling, curating data sets for common good use. But more often than not, some of the citizen science projects that we work with aren't fully aware of what they need to do to make sure that the data that the citizens create not only meets established standards in the disciplines regarding quality and documentation, but is also available for others to use over longer periods of time. So I'm not going to go into all these different areas, which undoubtedly are relevant to consider citizen science as a data-centric practice, but I will focus on three. And so the first one is going to be a quick one. I'm just going to talk about an experiment where we're trying to understand how useful data can be when it is collected from citizens in complex scenarios. Then we're looking at how could we come up with data governance models that account for the fact that the data is created through crowdsourcing, basically by a large number of people who aren't directly involved in the design of the experiment or the data collection protocols and have not been consulted about its use. And finally, a little bit about the privacy implications of citizen contributions. So starting with the first question, this has been work that we have done in a European project called Crowd, which I have led until the end of 2019, and it was all about collecting mobility data in urban contexts. So we have developed AI workflows and pipelines to collect information about mobility data sets in cities, and we've partnered with European cities for this purpose. So one of the scenarios we have explored is really around understanding people's mobility patterns. So as a city council, you really want to have very detailed data, not just about the timetables of your public transport, but also perhaps about the occupancy of buses and alike, now especially important in times of social distancing and alike. You also want perhaps to know how people use different means of transport and whether they serve all audiences and demographics equally well, and so on and so forth. This information, for all sorts of reasons, is not always available to city planners. And I'm not going to go into details why. There's various reasons around data ownership and the way the data is collected and the costs of current methodologies. But in the Crowd project, we basically developed this hybrid workflow, which involved a mobile app where we collect data from city residents about their daily trips and the modes of transport they use, paired with a machine learning algorithm that combines different AI techniques and that is particularly optimized not to need huge amounts of data, given that we are indeed asking volunteers to contribute this information to us. In particular, among others, we're also we used an active learning approach basically to make sure that we're only asking about trips, about mobility data that the machine learning part of the pipeline is not sure about. One of the challenges that we have encountered with this is really about the user experience. So imagine you have a mobile app that we have developed from scratch in the project, where you have to ask people about the trips that they have taken on public transport on a given day. So there's a whole range of user-related questions that you need to ask related to how often do you ask this without boring people and making them perhaps drop out. There's questions about how long you can wait with the answers to get reliable data. People forget. I mean, if I would ask you exactly where did your trip started 2 days ago, and when did you swap, and where did you leave your bike, and when you switched on a train, and so on and so forth, you might not be able to give me that data in a reliable way. And then we had various interface design where we show people all information that we could infer using machine learning about their trips just by tracking them, to support them basically in recalling and which mean of transport they used in each trip segment, which are basically here. So one of the main learnings for us was really that when it comes to citizen-generated data that is not generated, using standard platforms that we know from crowdsourcing, you would very likely need to have a bespoke tool to collect this data, and you will need to reserve resources and have the capabilities in-house to think about bespoke interfaces and experiences. The other challenge we had was about data quality. So we were asking people to tell us about their daily public transport journeys that the algorithm had inferred. And we weren't entirely sure, besides questions of the usability of interface, whether people will actually be able to spot errors that the algorithm makes. Because obviously there is noise in the data and how tracking is used and how the inference algorithm worked with limited data. And we just wanted to make sure that people, when they confirm automated results, that they would also, that these confirmations would also be accurate. So what we've basically done is we have run an experiment where we have taken the results that the algorithm had computed, but we have also manually introduced some errors so that we can exactly track how much people pay attention and perhaps are able of remembering and recognizing the errors that the algorithm make, which were of several types. Yeah, so these 1, 2, 3 here are different trips between different points, A, B, C, and so on and so forth. These nodes here are basically what we call segments. So parts of a journey that are completed using a particular mean of transport, here bus and here walk. So we had errors in where these segments would start and stop. We had errors related to the means of transport that the algorithm inferred, and so on and so forth. And we basically wanted to make sure that people will do their best and will actually be able to tell us true valid data, given that we actually don't have independent crowd truth. So as I was saying, we've injected these artificial errors, and then we run a study asking people to measure that the errors are corrected, assuming that such noise, artificial noise, aren't really accidental corrections. And then we use the ratio of discovered natural errors to discovered artificial errors to basically get a sense of a residual error rate that the algorithm would need to take into account. Long story short, we had a small interview study with 10 participants and 5 of their journeys, which we have tracked, and we've added 4 types of classes corresponding to those 3 examples of trips that I had on the previous slide, and then we've basically scored their answers. The good news, and there's if we have written a report about this if you're interested. The good news really is that in our case, at least, those errors seem to be able to be corrected by people. At the same time, we noticed, or our doubts, initial doubts, were confirmed that errors can indeed mislead and can persist over several rounds of corrections. And there's a whole range of complex cases that we have taken into account in the design of the interfaces, and that all this is all preliminary results basically, but that all points to the need to really do more research into data collection methodologies and data labeling methodologies for machine learning that go beyond, standard tasks that are perhaps supported in citizen science and crowdsourcing. The other piece we've done in Crowd is around data governance, and you may be aware. So this is a topic where legal scholars and others have proposed various models such as trusts and co-ops to facilitate the use and reuse of data sets across organizational boundaries. So the idea is that instead of organization A sharing data with organization B, they decide to put that data in a trust in a particular structure, legal structure, operational structure, that determines who can use that data. and in which scenarios. Say there's quite a few pilots available, and in the paper we have written for the Data and Policy Journal, we have a list from last year of existing pilots for those of you who are interested. This being an active field of research, there's also lots of operational details that are really unclear, including actually the legal form. So whether a data trust is a trust in the way lawyers understand it, or just shares some basic principles around the availability of a board of trustee that decides what happens, and sharing, or just that sense of having to have a model of governance that shares benefits of using data more broadly. But one limitation of all pilots, according to our research, is that most of the findings we know from existing case studies don't really transfer well to citizen-generated data. And so we've looked into that specifically. And we've done a study on Figure 8 back in the day, where we analyzed two specific aspects. So in the first survey, we looked at the perspective of someone who contributes to a data set, and we wanted basically to assess how contributors would react to delayed or perhaps uncertain rewards that would be created through data trusts and co-ops. For instance, if people would be included into profit sharing or royalties, what would be their perception of that? And in the second survey, we looked at contributors, which could be crowd workers or citizens, as trustees. And we wanted to understand how contributors would make decisions about the terms of use of the data in certain scenarios. And then we've collected some basic demographics, and we've analyzed the free text answers we have received thematically. So just a few more details, and there's actually much more in the paper if you're interested. So in the first survey, we asked people to assess the fairness of these three scenarios, which they would compare. In the first one, which refers to proprietary data, so our baseline scenario is you have a private entity that is creating a data set using crowdsourcing and exploiting the results for private gain, and pays the workers the way, or reward the workers in a traditional way. Then we've looked at the scenario with delayed or perhaps uncertain additional rewards after 5 years, which is basically a simplified trust model. So still a proprietary data set exploited by the entity crowdsourcing data collection for private gain. We still reward people for their initial contribution, but we also say that there might be profit sharing and royalties down the line if the data is used and generates profit. And finally, an open data scenario where we have a public sector entity that is using the data for commercial gain, for profit, but is also making it available to others openly. In the second survey, in the trustee perspective, we basically asked people to read the description of a fictional data set and a potential user of this data set. So it was all in healthcare. So we basically had a for-profit, a US-based company using it to develop a new diagnostic machine, a Swedish version of it where some of these machines would be donated, Brazilian company, given that we've noticed in the first survey that lots of the participants were from South America, and a public sector, publicly funded research institution that isn't actually making any profit from the data, is also not developing any tech or tool to help anyone directly. And we've asked people to indicate how these organizations should be allowed to use the data sets that they have helped create and for what fee. And then people could also submit questions to the organizations for clarification and also provide a rationale for their decision. The results were quite interesting. So we had a total of 68 participants, more or less split split equally across the two surveys. For survey 1, so there was a lot of commentary about the fixed payment, immediate payment, which participants in figure 8 considered actually to be the most important. They were quite skeptical of delayed payments, and even if they are in addition to the main one, mostly because of risk and because of a fear of discounting of deferred rewards. So people mentioned that future is uncertain and they prefer to have sure money. They also mentioned that if the payment, some of the payment is delayed, they have perhaps less freedom in when they get it and how much it is and how they spend it. The distribution of income was perceived as fair by participants in all 3 scenarios, though several have commented on the gap between the profit the companies make versus individual incomes. At the same time, they also said that if the organization doesn't actually make a profit from the data that they work on, then people also, they don't expect any additional reward. So that third scenario, open data, was received most positively and seemed connected to workers' motivations. In the second survey, we've asked basically people to rank the companies that should pay, or the organizations that should pay highest fees. And perhaps unsurprisingly, those that were making profit were ranked higher, so should pay more to use the data. Those doing public goods should perhaps get a discounted access. People also mentioned quite often the challenge around fair compensation of time and effort by contributors to, and its relationship to the profit that the organizations make. Interestingly, also, some noted that the research organization has quite a small budget, so they weren't sure if they would be able well enough. People wanted to know how the donations of the Swedish company would be distributed geographically. So when a company is claiming, or organization is claiming to do something for the common good, it's perhaps important to also consider more details about it and how these match people's own expectations and concerns. To follow up, we basically proposed 3 different options for implementing data trust-like governance models for crowd workers, and for crowd work. So for situations where a data set is generated ultimately with the help, rewarded help or otherwise, of large numbers of people. Data sets, we think, are could act as a pragmatic vehicle for the stake that the crowd of volunteers put in current data collection and analysis pipelines that we're using in science and elsewhere, for instance, in AI research. Our participants were very positive about being involved in this consultations and discussions around how their data, or data work in general, is shaped by this sort of new organizational structures like data trusts and co-ops. And like I said, we came up with 3 possible ways to explore this further. So an option, and there is a figure in the paper as well that explains it. So in the first option, the data provider, say the organization that crowdsources some of the data processes, could decide to grant the data set to a trust at a later point. And one needs to, of course, to ensure that the interests of those who contribute are aligned with the goal of the trust as well, and explore how that would change motivations and practices. And option B, which is on the right-hand side in the data users box, the data trust controls downstream employment of crowd workers. Say there is a data trust that is managing a data set or a collection of data sets, and among the things that trustees decide on is how citizens or crowd engagement would be managed. That would also require a higher degree of peer-to-peer trust, as noted by some of the participants. If the crowd were to be involved as trustees, some participants mentioned that they wouldn't trust their peers to decide on how the work would be distributed. And finally, option C, where the value of the data that the data generates further down the line is given back to the contributors directly, though we do need to look at questions around risk aversity and their focus on more immediate earnings. Another challenge that we see there is to make sure that people trust and understand the added value of the governance structure, reassure people, but also consider things like digital currencies to manage long-term earnings and stake. Further on, our study had mostly contributors from South America and a long tail of other countries. But from the responses, we could clearly see an international dimension of data crowd work that requires a much more nuanced account of perceptions and motivations and behaviors. Also, crowd projects, including citizen science, are organized differently than regular work. So when creating a trust, one would need to think about how to choose perhaps representatives or to form bodies that can act as a sounding board on behalf of the crowd. The study we've done was on a platform that provides financial rewards for data contributions. In citizen science, it is common as well to ask volunteers for help, just to help scientists or contribute to a common good. Citizen science projects are often run by non-private entities, as I was saying earlier, and for the public good. So that means they fall into our scenario C in the first survey and in the fourth category in the second survey. At the moment, we're running a follow-up study to understand how governance could look like in scenarios where people contribute voluntarily and do not depend on these contributions to earn a living. This is a study that we're running in the Action Project in a pilot called Mapping Mobility, which is very related to the crowd scenario I had explained earlier in collaboration with Kiel University and the University of Southampton. That brings me to Action, which is this Horizon 2020 project, which I'm leading right now, where we want to ultimately design a toolkit with resources and guidance for participatory science in an area that spans across different natural sciences, all sharing the aim of tackling some form of pollution. The project itself is building a citizen science accelerator, where we have held an open call and selected from among hundreds of participants 16 citizen science pilots that work with us for a period of 6 months. These are the pilots, so there are 16 of them. They're from all over Europe, some of them even with an international dimension, and they cover a whole range of pollution scenarios in terms of what is polluted, so water, air, and how, through noise, through pesticides, through light, through various other means. If you're interested in the pilots, they're really, really interesting, quite a range of activities and interventions and engagements that people come up with in their areas to tackle pollution concerns. But to the challenges, so one of the main challenges we have noticed is around data literacy, specifically around understanding privacy implications, volunteer contributions in these sort of citizen science projects. And we have, from the 16 projects we had, actually at the time we started the study, we just had 9. The remaining 7 joined in 2021. We have selected 4 that are run, 3 by public authorities and professional scientists, and 1 is a grassroots movement run by citizens themselves that collect and analyze pollution data, which will ultimately be used for research purposes and to support policymaking. None of the case studies work with vulnerable audiences, and all of them collect data in a non-anonymous way, because we were interested in privacy implications. And if you're interested in the names, it's Street Spectra, Azotea. These are Spanish-based projects in light pollution. Sound samples of Barcelona happening. So the final project is a biodiversity project running for several decades, based in the Netherlands, where people are asked to go in the fields according to a predefined track and count the number of dragonflies and other insects they find. And based on these counts, scientists understand the impact of certain types of pesticides that are used or not used in that area, in soil and water, on biodiversity. So the study design included some document analysis and interviews with the people who run these 4 citizen science initiatives to understand the context, followed by a survey with the volunteers themselves. And besides socio-demographic details, we've collected in the survey information about how people engage and why, about what data and metadata contributions they make. So by data, we mean the actual things that they are asked to submit. By metadata is all the additional information around geotagging and the like that accompanies their submissions. We wanted to understand how people understand the role of this metadata and its context and the perceived risks, as well as the links between the expected uses of the contributions and the rewards or acknowledgements people get, sort of mirroring some of the concerns we had in the study about data trusts for crowd workers earlier. We've sent the study to more than 300 participants that were that had allowed the 4 citizen science projects in the accelerator to be contacted for this sort of purposes, and we've received almost a third of responses back. And then 3 volunteers also were happy to be contacted by us for follow-up interviews. In summary, people were supporting the projects because they identified with the goals to a very large extent, and were supporting science in general, and as well as they were interested in the outcomes of the research. Perhaps more interestingly, they had quite a good understanding of data contributions, so what they're asked to produce in most cases, much less so of the additional metadata that they are collecting or they are passively submitting virtue of the digital tools that they or the citizen science managers are using, as you can see on the bar chart on the right-hand side. There were huge differences between the excuse me, between the 4 projects, possibly due to their context and duration of participation and so on and so forth. So I've mentioned the Dutch project has been going on for many decades, with people basically sometimes training their friends and children and so on into continuing to contribute to this initiative. Whereas the other projects, Street Spectra and Azotea, they are run by a team that is part of a very active grassroots community of people concerned about light pollution all over Europe, and are asking people to take pictures of light posts and submit them. Finally, noise maps was a much newer project where the designers had from the very beginning a good understanding of the implications in terms of privacy, because sound recordings that people would submit include voices of people with location. So there's been a much more concentrated effort to explain some of those risks. In terms of acknowledgements, though, things were quite interesting as well, because some of the newer projects seem to expect some form of acknowledgement. And then we've done some correlation analysis to the answers, with the answers from the previous questions, as well as to the demographics. So significantly, males are more likely to ask for acknowledgement than females, and there are further correlations to types of expected outputs, in particular when the project is expected to produce a paper or something of a kind. People are also more likely to ask for some form of acknowledgement. Interestingly enough, we couldn't find any correlation to the other questions, including to motivation. And last but not least, people had almost no understanding of the risks associated with what they were doing in terms of privacy and otherwise, which of course is a concern. So in all 4 case studies, participants contribute a lot of metadata. And by that, we don't just mean the login information that they submit to be able to participate and track their contributions, but also geo-information, labels, and many other types of information from their devices and apps that are submitted alongside the actual contributions. The participants' awareness of the data varies quite a bit. And some attributes were easier recognized by them than others. So for instance, in the Dutch case, people were very much aware that each of their counts of insects needs to be associated with metadata related to the time of day and weather and things like that, for it to make it useful for scientists. But they had much less understanding of more standard technical metadata attributes. Also, there was perhaps limited awareness across the project organizers, citizen science managers, that some metadata and the way it is submitted make the contributions less accurate or reliable. And that studying this metadata is a form of improving data quality. So for instance, in the street spectra project, where people submit pictures of light posts, which are then analyzed spectrally by scientists to understand how polluted that area is with respect to light. People, instead of taking pictures of the street posts instead of their house, they were just submitting streetlights from anywhere and then submitting them when they went home or in other cases, in other areas. These processes are really not well understood, both on the citizen science managers side and on the side of the volunteers. People are aware that digital tools hold their personal data, but we need to do more to explain them how that data is linked and what the consequences are, because awareness of risks is super low. It was a bit better in noise maps, where people from the beginning, or the organizers from the beginning, explained some privacy risks around recordings of environments. We really need to do more as a community, I think, to avoid what some scholars call data colonialism. So to ensure that participants are also able to understand news data that they contribute, not just scientists. And metadata is key to acknowledging contributions, which seem to be quite important in citizen science context. But if we don't have metadata about people to be able to track contributions to people, we might not be able to provide the types of acknowledgements that people expect. Though, like I said, in our case, we didn't find any correlation with motivation, so the impact on participation is unclear in this case. Either way, if we want to do science responsibly, also in citizen science cases, we need to come up with terms of use of data and metadata that reflect how we will use the metadata to provide such acknowledgements. So I'm going to wrap up now. So the things I'm working on now with my team, so following from those crowd studies, we're looking at ways to document crowdsourced data sets better, but also at standard methodologies to understand how feasible data labeling is in bespoke contexts, like this mobility scenario I had in crowd, or in action in the mapping mobility project. Transparency and accountability of data workflows in citizen science, including privacy implications. This is what we have learned from the final study. We need to think of way of communicating and capturing that. And finally, we need much more information and case studies into data trusts, other governance models that share value more widely, including with the citizens, and the way they could be really operationalized. And with that, if you're more interested in the project, the two projects, the links are here, and I'd like to thank Richard and Luis Geffian, the two project teams, the Citizen Science Pilots and the European Commission for funding all this. And now I hope you have some questions or feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. Very nice presentation. The projects that you presented are very interesting, and I'm pretty sure that they're raising quite a lot of questions. I would like to start with a question, and I don't know if it's a question, it's more of a discussion. I'm wondering to what extent we actually need to move from pure crowdsourcing or asking people to provide data to making them accountable for what they provide, or making them somehow part of the system, like understanding what's the purpose of collecting or giving this data and how we can do this better.
Yeah, I think, accountability is a very interesting concept. I don't know how I feel about that. Let me just start with the easier part of your question first. I think in citizen science, or in any other context where you operate with volunteers, it's very important to consider the dynamic of that group and how much they actually perceive each other as a group or as a community, or are just individually contributing because they think it's a worthwhile purpose. But to start with, if you as a scientist want to convince someone to donate some of their time and resources to do something for you for free, you really need to be very good at articulating why. There's other studies that I could talk about, but lots of initiatives really ask people to collect data from their own environment, right? So light pollution from the neighborhood they live in. We had a case study, a pilot in Portugal called In My Backyard, where it was about pesticides in people's backyards. So we were running these measurements with them and submitting them, and people understood why this matters, right? It's still a question of prioritizing this alongside all the other things that they have to do on a daily basis. But that question of why would I do it and how it matters to me is quite different in this context than perhaps in a paid labeling job. Now, the question of accountability is quite interesting, because in citizen science, there is an ongoing discussion about, and that came out of this final study as well, around acknowledgements, about what do you actually acknowledge? And people do want to be acknowledged, but we just don't know how. We literally don't know, because data is often aggregated. There's lots of curation that happens beyond this initial submissions, and we're not entirely sure of the privacy implications, for instance, as well. But ultimately, yeah, I think, having more at stake, for instance, by allowing or inviting citizens to be trustees on the board of the organization that governs how the data is used, is one way, not just to make sure that they have a stake in what is happening to the data, but also that they share some of the accountability.
Thank you very much for the answer. Indeed, I think there is no easy answer to this, and yeah. While we wait for other questions, I have another one, and is regarding the mobility project that you mentioned at the beginning. Do you have some plans on how to make people aware of errors, or how to better understand errors in the data that they see?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. So I think this would almost be the next step, right? So we haven't, our aim wasn't really to go towards explainability of what the algorithm was suggesting, though that would follow up almost naturally from what we did. But we wanted really to just see whether people can correct things, and whether they remember, whether they understand exactly where the error is, because it was quite a complex task. So it was really like it is often the case. So if you go beyond, machine learning tasks that are promoted at academic conferences, if you want to actually build a system that is using machine learning, then the tasks will be very complex. The context will be very different than these very artificial benchmarks that you have. The way in which people will provide feedback, whether it's through in a sort of distance supervision context, or like in our case through an actual app where we said, here's the trip, did it actually look like this? So in all these different contexts, we just wanted to make sure that people remember, and that people are able to do what we tell them, which is somewhat related also to the studies that I know some of you are doing on just making sure that when you crowdsource something, that people can actually, that they stand a fair chance to provide good answers when they want.
Thank you. We have another question, and I think Yencha would like to ask the question. Yeah.
Hi, this is Yencha. I'm a postdoc in TU Delft. So I have a question about stakeholder relationships. So I wonder how you perceive your role in citizen science projects and your team's relationships with other stakeholders. Like they could be citizen groups, could be maybe scientists in municipalities. And also, have you changed your role in different contexts? And how does that kind of affects the community's attitude? Just wonder that.
I have never been asked this. Okay, so give me 1 second. So yes, our role. So I run a computer science / HCI research team, right? So our role is, on the one hand, to help these citizen scientists and the teams that set up citizen science projects ultimately become more successful. And we're doing that by making them aware of certain challenges, and perhaps running studies and suggesting interventions for them to, understand how volunteers engage, understand how to measure quality and things like that. So there is that role. In action in this Horizon 2020 project specifically, I'm also in a different role because I run this accelerator. So I have, I forgot how much, 200,000 euros. Yes, 200,000 euros that I'm giving to 10 of these pilots. So I'm basically organizing this competition. I say, well, I want to work with really interesting citizen science projects, and they come and apply, and we sort of pick them based on what they're doing and their potential impact and how interesting they are, both from a citizen science point of view, but also from a research point of view. So, and then we give them 20,000 euros to run their pilots, and we help them alongside as well. So that's in action, which is quite a unique, it's quite a unique position to be in. But ultimately, so we are very much changing from this researcher, supporter, observer role to more and more understanding how citizen science as a method could be used by us as well and applied in our own research, in particular in sort of the paid crowdsourcing work that I'm doing as well.
Thanks a lot.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, we are a bit over time. So
Yeah.
I think,
Apologies for that.
no problem. It was very nice to hear about all these projects. And I hope people will connect with you after the presentation as well.
Yeah, no problem.
So with this, I would like to thank you again for the presentation, and we'll meet next week for another one. Thank you,
All right.
Elena.
Very good. Have a good week, everyone.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
too.
Bye.
Bye.